to type in your questions in the chat as we're going along, and either to me or in the group chat, and I'll do my best to answer those at the end of the slide here in about, we'll say, 20 or 30 minutes. Just to start off, I apologize if this is rudimentary, but just so we're all on the same page, the ASTM definition of additive manufacturing is the process of joining materials to make objects from 3D model data, usually layer upon layer, as opposed to, say, subtractive manufacturing technologies or traditional machining. So we're talking about building things layer by layer. Just to give you a quick glimpse of the workflow, if you're familiar with digital manufacturing, additive manufacturing is no different in that you're starting with a 3D model, some CAD data. You're bringing that into usually a separate program to do your programming, where it'll slice it into really thin layers, and then we'll send it to the machine for printing, and then there's always going to be some form of post-processing done to your 3D prints. I think it's valuable to help you guys understand that the programming is generally considerably less intensive for additive manufacturing than, say, machining. And this is one of the reasons why you can get to your part much faster. You can program a much higher number of parts a lot faster than, say, doing that on a CNC machine. You're going to start out with kind of the same mindset and knowing what technology and what material you want to build in. A key thing I'm going to highlight is part orientation. That's kind of a unique thing to additive manufacturing where you don't see in other manufacturing technologies. That's going to affect a lot of different things in the 3D printing world, as we'll find out later. Then generally we're picking how thick I want my layers to be that we're printing in. The software will generate our supports because we can't print in midair in most cases. And then finally, we'll generate tool paths and kind of do some fine tuning, just like you would with any other sort of programming. A big thing with additive manufacturing is layer lines, what people will call. If you notice the figure on the right, as you're building layer by layer, that space between the layers causes some anisotropy, which basically means that your part, depending on how it's built, will act differently under different loads and conditions depending on your orientation. So if I have a force going against the layer lines, that little thin tab is more likely to break than, say, if I oriented my part sideways, so the force is going kind of with the layer lines there. And generally, we're kind of building with between kind of 0.5 thousandth and a millimeter. For most technologies, you can go thicker or thinner, and that'll depend. But the key point I want to make here is don't mistake the anisotropy of additive manufacturing for weak parts. It's going to be there in all AM technologies, especially in weak, kind of thin features built in the Z direction. In most cases, people will orient or design around it, and it's getting better and better today where there's more materials and processes that kind of help eliminate these concerns. But don't mistake it for weak, because there are 3D print parts in airplanes and even on rockets that have gone into space. So a big thing with any manufacturing technology is post-processing. 3D printing is no different. Seldomly is a part ready for immediate use right out of the printer. And that could be from as simple as hand breaking a small piece of support off, all the way to machining off metal supports for metal 3D printing. So it varies greatly from plastic to metal. In any sort of engineering surface or tolerance, you're most likely going to have to post-machine, and that's mainly due to the limitations of the layer slice thickness and just the tolerances from 3D printers today in the industrial grade. As I mentioned before, part orientation is one of those really unique things to additive manufacturing, and how you orient your part will affect a number of other factors that will kind of determine your success with building a part using 3D printing. So say take this box with a screw boss. If I build it standing on its edge, I'm going to have a little stair stepping on my rounded surfaces. My screw boss might not be perfectly round, but it's going to be stronger if I'm going to be screwing onto it. However, the internal cavity is going to fill with support material. On the other hand, if I build it laying flat, I'm going to have a much rounder screw boss with maybe nicer looking threads, and this might be fine if it's just a prototype. And I'm more concerned about the fit rather than the strength of someone torquing on that screw boss. I'm going to have nicer corners, some better text, no support material. So this is just to kind of show you how there's so many things that you have to consider in 3D printing, and the orientation really is the driver of all those different give and takes that we have to deal with in additive manufacturing. Real quick on this slide, I don't want to get too deep into this, but I just, from my past experience, any part that I thought I could throw at a polymer 3D system, I thought I could throw at a metal system. That's not the case. Usually metal systems are a little more tricky to work with, have a couple more nuances than, say, a polymer system. But at the end of the day, you're 3D printing in metal, and you get all the benefits of additive, as I'm going to discuss, and the properties of metal. So to kind of help you guys understand where our costs are coming from in additive manufacturing and how that's different than traditional, we kind of have three main drivers of the cost of parts produced with additive manufacturing. A big one is machine time. You're generally dealing with longer build times per part than, say, like an injection mold cycle. That could be seconds or minutes. But again, I've seen parts that have taken 5 minutes, being very small, and I've had parts run for 120 hours. So it all depends on the geometry and what you're building. And generally, your cost of materials in additive manufacturing is much higher than traditional methods, just because of the little volume that's being used today. And that is changing as more and more people are adopting additive manufacturing. And then a huge thing that people don't always think about is that post-processing aspect, whether that's removing your support or doing a machining touch-up. Your parts may not be production ready right off the printer, and to get them from the printer into your product may take a significant amount of post-processing. So those are kind of the three drivers. And we'll take a look at that later on how to reduce So just a quick recap. AM is no different really than digital manufacturing, with the caveat that we have much less intensive programming than, say, machining in most cases. You do have to be aware of the anisotropy caused by building things layer by layer and stacking those layers. And then the key differentiator between additive and other manufacturing methods is orientation. How we build our how we orient our part is really critical to the success that we're going to have with 3D printing. And then just keep in mind of the differences between metal and polymer systems, and that the post-processing is usually more significant than other methods to get your parts production ready in some cases. So now we're going to kind of look at some of the different routes people use additive manufacturing for. And I want to kind of help spur on some ideas for you guys on how you could potentially be using 3D printing for your businesses to add value. There's kind of three questions that you should always be asking, and this is even for any manufacturing method, but you know, is it even possible to 3D print what I have in my design? Is there a piece of equipment out there that can produce my geometry? If not, maybe you have to go back and redesign it. But starting with the possibility, can can I even 3D print this is really key. And then you should be asking, is this going to meet my customer's requirements? Whether that's an engineer looking to get a quick prototype of a part, all the way from, say, someone who's looking at producing 3D printed spinal implants for surgery. So a lot of times you're asking, is my part strong enough? Does it look good enough? Is marketing going to be happy with this? You know, those requirements vary from industry to industry. And your internal validation in defining those requirements of success and failure is really what you should be asking yourself before you decide to move forward with production. And this is where it can get a little murky. Is 3D printing the best way to go? You can certainly 3D print a lot of things, but it's an expensive process kind of suited more towards lower volumes. So you want to be making sure that you're adding value to your products. Are you decreasing costs, decreasing lead time, or improving the overall quality of your part by 3D printing it? And then the big kicker, everyone in manufacturing knows, you know, is this a economical way to go, balancing that with the value that we're adding to the product by 3D printing it. So there's kind of 3 areas of focus that we're going to hit on: rapid prototyping, manufacturing tooling, and end-use parts. And I'm going to dive deeper into those real quick. So most people know that you use a 3D printer to get a rapid prototype. People are pretty aware of that for years now. The value proposition behind that is when you 3D print, you generally are getting your parts faster than relying on a supplier or a vendor or your internal processes to set up and tool up to produce that part. And 3D printing is especially competitive to traditional methods at the low volumes that you're doing, which is kind of what you're doing when you're prototyping. And you're reducing a lot of your capital expenditure on tooling. So if you make a lot of injection molded parts, prototyping and kind of getting a feel for those parts before you tool up can save you a lot of money in some cases. And it also allows you to do some functional testing before you get those first article pieces off the tool. The big thing I want to touch on for the MPMA, in a way I think you guys could focus on using 3D printing, is manufacturing tooling using 3D printing. So say I can't directly 3D print my part, but what if I could print the tool or the fixture to help manufacture my part? And there's a whole list of applications here. I could probably come up with another page, but this is kind of one of the bigger areas where people are using 3D printing right now outside of prototyping. And what I believe a lot of manufacturers are starting to realize is that they can get to their parts, assemble their parts, and add value to their manufacturing processes with 3D printing. I've seen people 3D print injection mold tools. Granted, if you can't 3D print in the material you want to mold in, you can make a mold and do a couple low volume runs to get a better feel. A big one is also end of arm tooling. There's a lot of custom end of arm tools for different applications that are being made, and 3D printing is a great way to test those, lightweight those. There's so many applications here. In fact, I have a good video here coming up to give you guys a quick break as we're transitioning out of kind of seeing how people are using additive manufacturing. And then finally, the home run that everyone's trying to hit with 3D printing is actually producing your end-use parts with 3D printing. And the people who are doing this successfully, they know that additive manufacturing can be a slow and expensive process if done incorrectly. So they're adding value through things like lightweighting, mass customization, consolidating part assemblies, embedding components into their 3D prints. You have a lot more design freedom with 3D printing, a lot more lead time reduction too. So they're taking advantages of these and realizing that there's an economic justification for moving to 3D printing And on top of that, they're designing for the process, which we'll get to here shortly, and they've mastered and validated their processes. An example here is a mandible replacement that was 3D printed out of metal. The person who designed and manufactured that met the requirements for biocompatibility, and it was able to be 3D printed, post-processed, and eventually put used in a surgery in real life. Just to kind of give you a taste of how people are using some end-use parts in highly regulated environments. So a quick recap, think of those three main application scopes. We're using rapid prototyping a lot. People are starting to 3D print tooling and manufacturing aids. And then finally, that home run everyone's trying to hit with 3D printing is end-use parts. And you should always be asking yourself, can I successfully, or should I be 3D printing this in the first place? And then always make sure that it's adding value to you, whether that's lead time reduction or cost reduction or quality to your part, if you're going to use 3D printing in any of those aspects. All right, we're gonna try doing a video here, seeing if we can get this to play. Let me know if you guys can't hear it. But this is a really neat company. It's a local company. It's a Minnesota company. They're one of the early adopters to 3D printing, and I think this is a really unique story in how they're using 3D printing in their manufacturing environment for some tooling and end-use parts. I apologize for that. You, David, no? Sorry about that. When we try to do videos, it can be challenging sometimes, but I'll leave the link here in the PowerPoint. All right, sorry about that, guys, for the sound difficulties there and the warbling, and hopefully your ears are okay. We'll kind of glance over this video later, but the key thing here is that they were early to adopt and understood the process for 3D printing in their environment. And once they really didn't have a good grasp on it, now they do, and they use it every day, and they can't live without it. So we'll leave the link here. We'll drop that in with the slides. It's at the bottom. You can watch that, but it's a really great video, really well done. And in fact, it's a new one. Some of these 3D printing videos kind of get recycled all over the place. So I'm happy there's a new one out there showcasing a Minnesota manufacturing company. All right, next slide. All right, finally, we're getting into some of the design tips and how you apply those design tips successfully to 3D printing. So this is going to kind of focus more on the manufacturing tooling and end-use parts, if you remember those areas of focus, because generally in rapid prototyping, you have less design freedom. And just remember that these are tips, kind of generalized tips for any manufacturing technology dealing with 3D printing. So depending on which machine or technology you're using, there's going to be slight variances in how you apply them. And feel free to ask some questions on that in the chat if you have questions, or we can follow up later. So there's a whole new rule book, a whole new playbook for additive, which opens up a lot more possibilities than traditional manufacturing. We're essentially starting with quote unquote nothing and growing apart from the raw material that we're using. We're no longer limited to what I can machine or what I can form or cast or mold. A way we kind of go about doing this is generative design software, or a topology optimized part. So there on the figure on the right, we have a part that was potentially designed for CNC machining. We'll bring that into a software, we'll apply our loads and conditions, and the software will spit out a couple different variants of parts that kind of look organic, that would be difficult to machine, but would help you add value for 3D printing. And with 3D printing too, you can also embed components such as sensors, magnets, fluid or cooling lines. We can combine assemblies to eliminate fasteners and joints, making our parts even stronger than before. Because of the kind of growing process, we're able to lightweight, and because of the less programming and lack of tooling, we're able to do more customization on a bigger scale and more economical than before. I have a quick kind of do's and don'ts for 3D printing. So we want to 3D print the complicated components for production. We don't want to be printing, say, PVC pipe or things like that that are simple that we can grab off the shelf. We're always going to want to avoid stress concentration because there's some level of heat and stress applied in each 3D printing process. So avoiding kind of those knife edge corners, sharp corners. A lot of times the 3D printing process will round itself out. Those sharp corners can cause stress concentrations where it may lead to cracking. And kind of print what you need to, nothing more, nothing less. A lot of times we're avoiding large solid masses of material. Remember, this is for outside of prototyping. And just a really key takeaway is to start simple. Don't overthink. We can worry about optimizing it for speed and cost later. Just keeping it small and keeping it simple first will allow you guys to have a lot more success starting off on the design process, because additive manufacturing allows us to fail faster, because we don't have to worry about that extended lead time for tooling or someone else printing those parts. So driving those three areas of cost down. So we're going to machine time down, driving the material cost down, and driving the post-processing cost down through some design tips and other factors. So reducing your machine time. Anytime that my machine is building support material, that is part of your part that is not going to be used in the final product. So anything we can do to design around that and eliminate that, and you'll kind of see reducing support usage as a theme here. Keep your parts low, minimize your Z height, keep your parts smaller if possible. The more layers are basically going to equal more machine time, which also means use your thickest acceptable layer resolution. If you have a large part with a bunch of really fine features, like say threads, a lot of times we'll 3D print in a thicker layer slice because we know it's going to take forever to get those threads to look nice if we use the really fine layer slice. So a workaround for that is to say use a heat stake insert, inserting those thread features after 3D printing to help get those parts off the printer faster. Another way to reduce your cost in 3D printing is to reduce the material used. Again, reducing the support material that you use will help reduce that. And particularly in FDM 3D printing, we'll use variable fill infill, and other 3D printing technologies. You'll use kind of a lattice or organic structure, kind of from that generative design area. This example here on the right, for scale, it's almost 2 feet by 2 feet. We gave it about a 1/4 to 1/2 inch thick wall thickness on the spots that it was going to be taking the force. But all that internal geometry wasn't really going to be taking the load. So we sparsed it out and made a kind of a sparse honeycomb infill there. So we make it solid where we need the strength, and we reduce the material in those non-critical areas. And the big thing here, reducing post-processing. Again, reducing the support used or orienting it so it's easy to remove those supports from, you know, say an external surface rather than kind of a internal feature. We always want to orient our parts so the critical surfaces don't appear as stepped from the layer lines, so you don't have to do as much machining afterwards. A big thing we can take advantage of in 3D printing is using a self-supporting angle. That figure on the right, it's usually about 45 degrees. Anything below that is where it'll generally fill with support, whether it's printing in thin air or to keep it down from a stress concentration. And we'll use self-supporting features like diamonds and teardrop shapes to help achieve this. So that's a key thing in design, is making sure you're designing self-supporting features if possible, to avoid that support material and lower your post-processing costs. I have a couple examples now of people that have successfully used design and they were thinking additively. This is a little older one, but this is a BMW badge placement aid. So basically a worker is aligning a badge on a vehicle. It was traditionally made and designed for CNC with a thick bar stock assembly, had multiple fasteners. According to them, it took them 18 days to produce this internally. Multiple assembly steps, several CNC setups, which can be expensive, and to boot, the ergonomics are not the greatest. And when they started thinking additively and taking these design tips and knowing where to apply additive manufacturing, tooling is a great way to save money and reduce your lead times. As you'll see here, they saved a 28% weight savings. Wear and tear on the worker from repetitive motion can be avoided. Your lead time dropped from 18 down to 1 to 2 days. And it was a single 3D printed piece with a couple hardware inserts afterwards. So they were printing those complicated components and using off-the-shelf pieces where it made sense. And at the end of the day, it was a 30% cost savings, and it had better ergonomics. Another one that's pretty famous across the industry is an end-use part that GE made. It's a fuel injector, and it kind of touches on each of the value propositions of additive manufacturing. And it's one of the most successful parts out there to date, because this fuel injector, there's these internal channels that were impossible to cast or manufacture by any other method. They took it from a 20-piece assembly down to a single component, so saving pieces from multiple vendors and suppliers, and bringing that all into one component. And by doing that themselves, they saved 1 year of lead time. And by making it one component, there was no joints. They actually made it stronger than its counterpart, which can sometimes be counterintuitive for people who think that 3D printing is weak. It is not when you're doing it right and applying it right. It had a 25% reduction in weight, which is the biggest kicker here for aerospace. It saved their customers $3 million in fuel every year for every plane. So you can kind of see the value that they added here. And yes, it is more expensive to produce it this way, but the value that they added to it completely outweighs that, and they're expected to produce 100,000 of these units by 2020, which for 3D printing is a huge volume. So just to kind of recap, always start with that part functionality in mind, and kind of remember those do's and don'ts when designing for additive manufacturing. And don't be afraid to take chances. Additive manufacturing makes it easy to fail faster than other methods. And we can optimize our designs later by orienting for less support and designing for less overhangs that would cause support and stress across the board, which will reduce your material usage, your machine time, and your post-processing time. Kind of transitioning out of that, so what does that look like for you? This can sometimes be the most tricky question, but I think it's an important question to address, and I've kind of tailored this for you, for the MPMA. A lot of people are asking, how do I use additive manufacturing in my business? How do I get on this additive train? I think the first step is really that mindset, is taking additive manufacturing as a serious, taking it seriously. It's not just a hobby, kind of low-end, not very strong technology. People are sending parts into space, using parts that are on airplanes. People are figuring it out. So I would challenge you guys to really view this as another viable manufacturing method in your day-to-day operations. And then another big thing is there's plenty of people around here in Minnesota who can partner with you to help bridge some of the knowledge gaps. 3D printing is kind of this catch-22 where you need to have it to know how to use it, but you also need to know what you're doing to know how to use it right. So ourselves, AdvancedTek, have partnered with many people in the state and across the Midwest to help people leverage 3D printing best. Stratasys, who we work with very closely, they also have a blueprint consulting arm, as well as the U of M. So just partnering up with anyone who kind of has that knowledge is also a great start. And a key thing I want to highlight too is just start 3D printing. You don't have to be perfect right out of the gate. You can prototype if that's possible for you, even if it's just a prototype tooling before you send it out to be CNC'd. Like I said, a lot of these things reduce the amount of times you're changing and sending a part out to a vendor or taking up time on your CNC if you're prototyping for it, just to kind of see that value proposition. And then as I mentioned before, the manufacturing tooling is a big thing that people are starting to use now, and I think that for folks at the MPMA could really leverage to have some success with 3D printing. Unfortunately, that video didn't work, but direct access to a quality piece of equipment does help spur on that innovation and validation internally, so they kind of know what they're looking for other applications that make sense to them. And then mostly, and finally, above all, make sure you're designing for the process for 3D printing if possible. And with that, we can move to some questions. I saw a couple questions pop up in the chat. I'm going to try to open it up here. We can kind of start from the top. Okay, so the first one is, how do you think small manufacturers are balancing the opportunities of AM versus the potential threat of replacing some of their current subtractive manufacturing? Are most adopting or less wanting to? I think that kind of goes down to the myth that people think that 3D printing is going to replace CNC machining, and that's just not the case. Most people in the industry believe that the technologies are complementary, in the fact that you can produce highly complicated geometries much faster and quicker than, say, a CNC machine would. But a CNC machine will always beat you on those engineering tolerances or surfaces where you need it. So people are actually using them in tandem, printing and CNCing what they need. But I don't think that it's going to replace CNC. I think it's going to complement the smaller manufacturers a lot. In fact, we're starting to see smaller manufacturers invest in some quality pieces of equipment to help with their CNC fixtures or etching fixtures, quality and inspection fixtures, things of that nature. So I think that the smaller players, they definitely are on the later end to adopt, but I definitely think we're starting to see a swing here for that. The next question is, how do you recommend companies implement DFAM if they don't have a lot of experience in additive manufacturing or a strong engineering staff? And that's kind of what I touched on before. I think partnering with companies like AdvancedTek or Stratasys Consulting or the U of M or other vendors who have strong knowledge in 3D printing can really help kind of bridge that knowledge gap if you're struggling or haven't used it. But another thing too is just get some 3D printed parts in front of you. Even to hold and feel and see a part will give you a lot better idea of the strength, particularly something that you would maybe 3D print. It's a great idea to bring to someone like AdvancedTek or Stratasys Direct, and we can make up for you before you kind of develop those applications internally. But as I mentioned, the strong foundation and understanding what additive manufacturing is and isn't, and kind of where people are using it and where they're not using it, is also very key for people to know if they don't have a strong engineering staff or a lot of experience. So I definitely think that partnering up with someone like us is a great first step, and also to be taking it seriously as a manufacturing method, as another tool in your tool belt. Next question, have regulatory bodies become more accepting of 3D printed devices either as validation testing or even production devices? Are the considerations in DFAM taken into account for later validation? So the regulatory bodies, the medical and kind of the aerospace, they're the ones that have been using 3D printing for the longest, and they're becoming a lot more accepting of it, especially in the aerospace. That lightweighting component leads to huge value propositions and savings for them and their customers. So these designs for additive are taken to account right away from the beginning. They're looking at the functionality of the part. What does my part do, and how can I use the benefits of additive to add value to this? That's when they're using the generative design software. That's when they're starting to get some ideas of shapes, and that's when they're looking at kind of optimizing it. All right, what way do I want to build it? How do I want to orient it? Are my supports going to be on an outside surface that are going to be easy to clean up? So as I mentioned before, they're doing most of the design work kind of first off the bat, and then kind of taking a look at the options that they have to optimize it for the specific platform that they're building on. But they're also running a bunch of dog bones in those builds and testing them, and they have their own kind of secret sauce qualification for their process that they've been developing for years. We can invite people to our website to watch the UMC video later as well. Would I happen to know how much the BMW fixture costs to print? Not off the top of my head. I'm sure there's a a slide or a white paper. In fact, I'm pretty sure that I did see it somewhere, so I can send that to you later, Steve. What is the cost for a good metal printer? So this is actually a very interesting question. So what is a good metal printer to begin with? There are certainly metal printers out there. The ones that are out there, there's kind of two methods right now for metal printing. It involves a lot of loose powder, and you're basically firing a laser at a bed of powder to produce your parts. That's where you're having to machine off supports. It's amazing that if you look at microscopic images of that laser, how it's controlled chaos in there. But a good powder bed fusion printer, or even there's extrusion-based printers that extrude kind of a metal powder and binder, and it's like a metal injection molding process where you debind and sinter it after. So there's kind of two routes to go there. The extrusion-based printers that we carry, like Desktop Metal, I'm not in sales, so don't quote me on this, but I believe they run around 150 to 200,000. And they're good for really low volumes in an R&D setting or tooling setting, where those kind of powder bed systems are good more in a manufacturing setting where you're filling that powder bed with a lot of different parts and running lots of parts in a production setting, kind of outside of prototyping environment. So the cost there I've seen little ones go from 250,000, and they have them all the way up to 2 million plus. But I know Desktop Metal is definitely the most accessible metal printer on the market, just from you don't need to have any HVAC requirements for the loose powder because everything's bound up. And I can shoot you some more information on that later, Steve. So the answer to that is I would say Desktop Metal is a solid printer, and yes, we're a little biased here on that with AdvancedTek, but it is true that the extrusion-based printers, just due to the lower volumes that they can produce than, say, a powder bed fusion printer, they're more suited towards people who are making really low volumes of metal parts in like an R&D production or kind of tooling setting. And it even allows you to scale up a little bit to production. And the nice thing with Desktop Metal is the support's all removed by hand because we're sintering and we have a ceramic release layer that allows us to just hand remove. There's some cool videos online if you look those up for Desktop Metal. Whereas the powder bed system, you're machining those supports off, which can add a lot of cost and hassle to people in that environment. But the catch with that is you're most likely going to have to machine if you need a tolerance, and with the extrusion-based printers and sintering, you have to kind of design around sintering parts in a furnace, not so much on the powder bed fusion systems, where you're more worried about support removal and stress concentrations. So I don't see any other questions. Well, just thank you again, guys, for joining us today. Hopefully this was beneficial to you. I'll be following up with people who had questions that I couldn't fully answer individually. And I believe this is recorded, so we'll look at distributing that out later. And like I said, you can reach out to us at AdvancedTek anytime if you're looking to partner or leverage additive manufacturing. And thanks again to Steve and the MPMA for hosting us. We're really appreciative of that and the opportunity. And hopefully you guys have a good rest of your week. Thank you.
Thanks, David, and thanks again to AdvancedTek for co-hosting, and thank you all for joining us. And as David mentioned, we'll make sure everything's available, the PowerPoint, the video, so we'll reach out to you with that, and hopefully we'll see you again at some MPMA events, and thank you very much. Take care.